I can't quite recall when our family gatherings stopped being about love and started revolving around status, but that night, inside the grand Winslow estate just outside Santa Carmelita, I realized I had never truly belonged at the table. My cousins sat under the soft flicker of crystal chandeliers, sipping vintage wine and launching their latest achievements like volleys in a war of egos, one boasting about a boutique hotel chain along Monterey Bay, another gushing about a yacht named after herself. As usual, I stayed quiet in my corner by the fireplace, cradling a cup of lukewarm peppermint tea, wearing the kind of smile you put on like a coat that no longer fits. "I heard you're still living in that little apartment on Willow Avenue." Aunt Helen's voice floated through the room, honeyed and barbed all at once, and just like that, the spotlight turned. "Still renting, are you?" Bonnie, my younger cousin, raised her eyebrows in mock pity, then let out a soft laugh like a slap in velvet gloves. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sting of being so casually dismissed again. They didn't know, of course. None of them had the faintest idea that I was the one who had quietly signed the acquisition papers on that very building. Through a private real estate fund so discreet, it might as well have been a myth. "These days, who even rents?" Bonnie sighed, as if I were a warning label stitched onto the family's reputation. "A Winslow by blood, living like a tenant." I said nothing. I didn't need to. Every word they said only stoked the quiet fire I'd carried for over a decade. They didn't know who I really was. But they would. Not through confrontation, not through vengeance, but through documents they'd soon receive, documents bearing my name, inked with the authority they thought I could never hold. I had just begun to think the worst was behind me, that maybe their usual jabs would end with a few smug chuckles and another toast to themselves. But I was wrong. The moment I set my glass down, Bonnie leaned in, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of condescension disguised as concern. "Do you even have a mortgage, Jules?" she asked, voice syrupy sweet but sharpened like a blade. "Or are you still renting that cramped place with the peeling paint and the street parking?" The room chuckled, politely at first, but soon freely, like my life was the evening's designated punchline. My Uncle Charles smirked without even looking up from his phone. "You're pushing 40, sweetheart," he muttered. "It might be time to grow up and invest in something real." And there it was, the full dismissal, not just of my lifestyle, but of my effort, my independence, my years of quiet labor. They didn't ask why I lived where I did or what I'd built behind the scenes. They didn't see the countless hours I'd poured into every zoning application, every contract negotiation, every midnight meeting with city inspectors to save projects on the brink. All they saw was the worn leather of my boots and the lack of a zip code they deemed worthy. I smiled, just enough to keep my composure, and said simply, "I like the space." That, apparently, was invitation enough. Uncle Charles chuckled. "You like the space," he repeated with a scoff. "Well, I suppose someone has to like those aging walk-ups. It's just not what we envisioned for a Winslow." His tone was casual, almost bored, but it landed with a cruel precision, as if I'd committed some silent crime against the family name simply by choosing a modest life. And then came the final blow. "I heard that entire block on Willow got sold last quarter," Bonnie said, swirling her wine with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes she knows more than you. "Word is, the buyer's going to level the whole thing. Guess you'll be moving out soon, huh?" She laughed lightly, as if it were all just an amusing anecdote, my supposed eviction. I kept my posture relaxed, but inside my heart pounded, not from fear or anger, but from restraint. They had no idea that I was the buyer, that the entire block now belonged to me through a trust they'd never trace, and that I had no intention of demolishing anything. In fact, I was overseeing a historically sensitive renovation designed to preserve those buildings and protect the tenants, families who had lived there for decades, some for generations. But at that moment I said nothing. I let Bonnie bask in her false superiority, let Charles shake his head in disappointment, and let the silence between us speak volumes. To them, I was still the black sheep in faded denim and thrifted cardigans, the relative you speak about in whispers, as a cautionary tale over cocktails. Of course, Bonnie continued, if you do get kicked out, there's always room at the guest house. We could help you find something more respectable. Maybe even someone respectable. The laughter that followed was soft, measured, but sharp enough to slice through bone. I met her gaze and replied, calm as ever, I'm happy, and so is my landlord. The irony burned quietly in the back of my throat. Because I was the landlord. I held the deed. I approved the maintenance budget. And the only reason they hadn't seen my name yet was because I never needed them to see it. What I needed was patience. Because I knew something they didn't. In less than 24 hours, the renewal contracts for Ashcroft Plaza, the very estate we were dining in, would land on their desks, and printed right there in plain ink would be the name of the firm they couldn't trace but would soon fear. Mine. They returned to their wine and whispers as if I had simply vanished into the wallpaper, as if my presence no longer warranted even the courtesy of eye contact. The laughter resumed, softer now, veiled beneath a sheen of civility, but no less cruel for its polish. I listened as they shifted conversations back to their portfolios, their Aspen retreats, and the private equity firms they claimed to sit on the board of, while my name, my worth, and my silence were quickly filed away under the label of irrelevance. Even my father, once the only voice in that room who'd offer a hand under the table when the heat turned up, seemed more interested in scrolling through his phone than intervening. His silence wasn't neutral. It was heavy, weighted with quiet disappointment, as if my existence had become an inconvenience he no longer wished to explain. At some point he glanced up, not to check on me, but to casually diffuse the conversation with a half-hearted, let's be kind, before returning to whatever notification had just pinged across his screen. The message was clear. He wasn't going to defend me. Not this time. Maybe not ever again. My mother, seated at the far end, simply adjusted her pearl bracelet and looked away, as if watching the door was more comfortable than meeting my eyes. I wasn't just being excluded, I was being erased. In that moment, surrounded by my blood yet feeling utterly severed from it, I understood what true loneliness meant. It wasn't just being alone, it was being unseen in a room full of people who were supposed to know you best. And not only did they not know me, they had decided I wasn't worth knowing. To them, I was the unmarried daughter, the unremarkable cousin, the woman who never quite figured it out. I wasn't an asset to be celebrated, I was an inconvenience to be tolerated. What stung most wasn't the lack of praise. I had long since stopped expecting that. It was the casual dismissal, the way my identity had been distilled down to a rented address and a few assumptions, none of which came close to touching the truth. I wasn't grieving their rejection. I was grieving the hope I'd still secretly held that one day they might look at me and see more than failure wrapped in politeness. And yet, even in that hollow ache, something stirred. I thought of the contracts waiting on my desk, the audited statements, the forensic reports, and the sealed envelopes addressed to each board member with signatures they couldn't ignore. I thought of the 10 years I had spent working in silence while they laughed, of the deals they'd mocked me for turning down, deals I'd only refused because they would have gutted the heart of neighborhoods I believed in. The version of me they pitied wasn't real, but their blindness, their arrogance, and their indulgence in the illusion, it was. And it had left them vulnerable in ways they couldn't even begin to fathom. They had no idea that while they saw me as small, I had been quietly building something immovable, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for the simple, stubborn desire to create something they couldn't take from me or take credit for. And so I sat back in my chair, surrounded by my family, yet more alone than I'd ever been, and waited. Calmly, patiently, for the truth to surface, because I knew that the next move was already in motion, and it wouldn't be loud, but it would be undeniable. I didn't storm out that evening. I didn't raise my voice or throw their cruelty back at them in some dramatic tear-streaked moment they might have expected. Instead, I smiled gently, as if their words had washed right over me, and quietly excused myself under the pretense of an early morning meeting. I gathered my coat from the polished entry bench, one I had approved the budget for though they didn't know it, and stepped out into the cool air of the Santa Carmelita Hills, with only one thought echoing through me. They still have no idea who they're dealing with. The drive home was silent, save for the faint clicking of my car's turn signals and the hum of the engine as I wound through the hills toward my apartment on Willow Avenue. The same street they'd mocked, the same building they pitied. But to me, it was more than a roof. It was a symbol. It was the very first acquisition under my firm, Glenmere and Company, a quiet, deliberately faceless holding group I had built brick by brick through countless late nights and early mornings, fueled by discipline, not drama. They saw an aging walk-up with ivy creeping up the bricks and mailboxes that still used keys instead of codes. What they didn't see was the stability I'd preserved there. Rent-controlled units for retired schoolteachers, veterans, and second-generation immigrant families who had called it home long before gentrification circled like vultures. They didn't know I had chosen that building not for profit but for purpose, and they certainly didn't know that I had used it as the foundation of something far more formidable. By the time I pulled into my modest carport and turned off the ignition, the veil had lifted. I no longer felt bruised by their words. If anything, their dismissal gave me clarity, a final confirmation that I didn't owe them explanations or reconciliation. What I owed myself was the follow-through of everything I had planned in silence. Back in my apartment, I walked past the thrifted furniture they would scoff at and sat at my work desk, flipping open the leather binder that held the final audit report for Hillsborough Plaza, the jewel in the Winslow family's crown and, as of 6 months ago, majority owned by Glenmere & Co. The transaction had been completed through a private equity channel. None of them was smart or humble enough to trace. They'd never suspect the girl in second-hand clothes, the woman they thought just showed rental units, could be behind the very firm now threatening the ground beneath their feet. I had waited. I had listened. And now, with the audit complete and the paper trail impeccably laid, the next phase could begin. My assistant Isla had already arranged the morning's logistics. Meeting packets had been printed on thick bond paper, neatly tabbed and sealed, each marked for a board member by name. The cover letter was short, professional, and direct. It bore the Glenmere insignia and detailed a list of concerns regarding financial discrepancies, misuse of communal funds, and favoritism in contract awards. There were no threats, no accusations, only the cold, exact language of business, the kind that leaves no room for emotional appeal. The legal filings were done, the independent audit results triple-checked. The timing, intentional. Tomorrow's board meeting would begin as just another routine update on tenant policies. They would enter the room as owners, as gatekeepers of legacy, and they would leave realizing they were neither. That night, before bed, I stood at the window overlooking the city I had grown into. Port Calhoun wasn't glamorous, not in the way my cousins fetishized coastal properties and gated communities, but it was real, and it was mine. The streetlights blinked rhythmically, casting soft reflections across the hood of my parked car and the brick-lined sidewalks I walked every day, unnoticed. I didn't need a marble foyer or private jet to feel successful. I needed this, the quiet knowledge that while they dismissed me, I was building a legacy they couldn't see coming. I didn't prepare for revenge. I prepared for truth, for justice, for a reckoning built not on bitterness but on integrity. And when the time came, I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't have to. The next morning, the air in my office carried that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm, not chaotic or loud, but thick with something inevitable. I arrived early, earlier than usual, not because I needed extra time, but because I wanted the stillness to settle around me like armor. My assistant Isla was already at her desk, crisp and composed as always, placing a cappuccino beside my laptop with a quiet nod. "They're seated," she said, her voice calm but laced with anticipation. "The boardroom is full and your family, they arrived early. Looks like they're trying to cozy up to the independence." I didn't laugh, though the image was almost comical. Preston, with his exaggerated charm, shaking hands and talking legacy while hoping no one asked him what a balance sheet actually looked like. Bonnie, offering smiles too sweet to be sincere, likely trying to distract from the panic that had surely begun to curl around her chest once whispers of Glenmere's audit hit the airwaves. "Are the files ready?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Everything's printed, organised and distributed as planned," Isla confirmed. "Legal reviewed everything twice. Audit findings are watertight. And the press statement goes live in 20 minutes. I nodded, not out of nervousness, but because everything I had worked for was finally aligning. The pieces were all in place and the final move was mine. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught my reflection in the glass. Gone were the cardigans and denim, replaced by a navy suit with clean, assertive lines, tailored not for attention but for presence. I didn't look like the girl from Willow Avenue anymore, the one they had pitied and mocked. I looked like someone who built, someone who had come not to ask for respect but to define it. The boardroom quieted the moment I entered. At the far end, seated in a tight cluster like schoolchildren waiting for detention, sat my father, my cousins, my aunt, each of them adorned in the polished confidence they wore like armor, unaware of how thin it had become. Preston stood first, brows furrowed. "This is a private meeting," he said, voice tinged with confusion and something else, fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm Julia Winslow," I said calmly, placing my briefcase at the head of the table, founder and sole owner of Glenmere and Company, the investment firm that currently holds majority ownership of Hillsborough Plaza and several other properties this board is accountable for. Aunt Margaret turned pale, the colour draining from her face faster than any word could reach her lips. Bonnie stared, her mouth parted slightly as if her mind couldn't reconcile what her eyes were seeing. My father, once the man who taught me to tie my shoes, and later forgot to ask how I paid my rent, gripped the pen in his hand, knuckles white. "Julia," he whispered, as if saying my name might somehow restore the power that had silently shifted. I nodded once, gently. "Good morning." I opened the briefcase, pulling out the audit documents, each meticulously labelled and tabbed. I placed them on the table one by one, each one a mirror held up to a family that had long since stopped seeing itself clearly. "We're here to review your financial records," I said evenly, starting with the $2.3 million listed as structural repair for the rooftop lounge. "Preston, I believe that corresponds with the exact cost of your Jackson Ridge property. Coincidence?" His face flushed, colour rushing up his neck like fire. I turned the next page. "Bonnie," I said, not unkindly, "can you explain why your husband's firm billed the HOA 3 times the market rate for basic plumbing services, and why those payments were marked as emergency retrofits when no permits were pulled?" "You're airing our laundry to strangers," Aunt Margaret finally hissed, her voice rising in panic. "No," I replied, still composed. "You aired it out yourselves. I'm just making sure someone finally washes it." My father tried to speak again, his voice lower now, edged with something almost resembling regret. "We can explain, Jules." "I'm not here for explanations," I said, raising my hand gently. "I'm here to restore what this place was meant to be, a community, not a credit line." They looked around the room, suddenly unsure of who they were in this new reality. They had always assumed power belonged to the loudest in the room, the richest, the most flamboyant. But now, faced with paper trails and legal signatures, they were learning what real power looks like, silent, steady, and backed by substance. Bonnie whispered, almost dazed, "You really live on Willow." "I do," I said. And I own most of the block. No, I'm not tearing it down. Because some of us still believe buildings should protect people, not just portfolios. A ripple of movement went through the room as phones buzzed, notifications flooding in as the press release hit every real estate outlet on the West Coast. Glenmere and Company reveals CEO identity. Julia Winslow, local real estate developer behind $2 billion portfolio. The words once hidden in NDA-cloaked filings were now public. Preston looked up, his voice shaking. "This'll ruin us." "No," I said softly. "This will save you from yourselves." I paused just long enough to look each of them in the eyes, not with vengeance, but with clarity. "You have a choice," I said. "Work with me to rebuild this legacy the right way, or step aside. I hear there are some very affordable rentals in Northwood Hills." And with that, I gathered my papers, straightened my jacket, and walked out. Not with a raised fist, but with quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't demand respect because it has already earned it. The media coverage arrived like a wave that didn't crash but swelled, quiet and persistent, lifting everything I had built into the light. Within days, the board at Hillsborough Plaza reorganized under new leadership, and the sweetheart contracts, padded invoices, and side deals for favors began to dissolve like salt in water. Margaret stepped down from 2 philanthropic boards, citing health and a desire to reflect. Preston withdrew from his Aspen project, unable to explain the missing funds. Bonnie's husband's firm folded within 3 weeks of the audit release, but not before refunding overcharged fees to half a dozen co-ops. And yet, not all that followed was bitter. My father, stripped of his armor of denial, asked, genuinely this time, if he could understand the work I'd done. Not as a father trying to reclaim influence, but as a man who'd finally realized that respect isn't inherited. It's earned, often in silence. Months later, I found him sitting beside one of our property managers, poring over floor plans and lease agreements like a student. No longer the patriarch, but something softer, something teachable. Even Bonnie surprised me. She reached out not to justify or defend, but to ask if she could volunteer at the transitional housing centre we'd partnered with downtown. "I want to do something that matters," she said quietly, folding brochures instead of painting her nails. And maybe she meant it. Maybe, like me, she had started to understand that real success isn't sculpted in marble or measured in Instagram likes. It's found in small, intentional acts of repair. 6 months later, I was back at my apartment on Willow Avenue, the one they once mocked, the one I still kept, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because it reminded me of why I started. I sat with the quarterly reports spread across my kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside me, while tenant satisfaction rates climbed and the new childcare centre downstairs began welcoming families. Outside my window, the old bricks still held firm, and the street was alive with quiet resilience. Bikes clattered, dogs barked, and neighbours laughed in shared spaces we had fought hard to preserve. A knock pulled me from my spreadsheet. When I opened the door, my mother stood there. No pearls, no makeup, just jeans and a soft uncertainty in her eyes. She held an invitation in one hand, the one I had sent for the courtyard holiday party. "I wasn't sure I should come," she said. "It's not really my scene." I looked past her toward the small garden below, where fairy lights danced across the trees and the smell of warm cider drifted upward. "Maybe it could be," I said. She stepped inside slowly and picked up a framed photo on the shelf, me at 24, beaming at my real estate license ceremony. "I never asked," she murmured, "why you chose this path." I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to say it right. Because I wanted to build something real, I said. Not buy it, not borrow it, build it. And I wanted it to last. She looked at me then, not with judgment or skepticism, but with something quieter, something resembling pride. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Come tonight," I said. "Meet the families who live here, listen to their stories. That's where legacy begins." Later that evening, I stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching kids decorate cookies under Bonnie's gentle guidance, while Preston helped string lights with Mr. Marquez, one of our longest-standing tenants and a retired postal worker who still walked the block every morning at sunrise. My father stood beside me near the cocoa table, holding a cup awkwardly, searching for words that used to come easily but now had to be earned. "You know," he said, "your grandfather used to say buildings should shelter hearts, not just wallets." I nodded, thinking of the old ledgers I had found in his attic, filled with handwritten notes about rent forgiveness, community gardens, and roof repairs funded by bake sales. "We forgot that," I said softly. He looked at me, not as a daughter who'd gone astray, but as someone who had picked up the torch he'd dropped. "You could have destroyed us," he whispered. "That was never the point," I said, watching a young girl twirl in a halo of lights. "I didn't want revenge, I wanted restoration. And that's what I built. Not an empire, not a legacy with my name stamped in brass, but something that mattered, something that would last. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly counted out, maybe you saw a piece of yourself in this story. Maybe you too have been building something in silence while the world looked away, and maybe now, just like I did, you're ready to let it be seen, not for applause, but because it's time. So if this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What have you built while no one was watching? And if you're facing a moment like I once did, remember, you don't need their approval to begin. You need your purpose and your patience. The rest will follow. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of quiet strength, earned justice, and the kind of success that doesn't shout, it endures. Because sometimes the best kind of revenge is becoming exactly who they said you couldn't be.